Today we're going to cover my top 10 fantasy novellas. And to qualify to be on this list, the fantasy novella has to be something that can stand alone. I want you to be able to pick up the novella and jump straight into the story. It can be in a fantasy novella series, but it can't be in one of those big epic saga. That's right, I'm looking at you, Brandon Sanderson. Coming in at number 10, we have The Last Tsar's Dragons by Jane Yolen and her son, Adam Stempel. This novella is an alternate history that adds dragons into the fall of Nicholas Romanov in the Russian Empire. We follow many point of views, and we see the fall that is caused by dragons, the love of his wife, and the greedy servant Rasputin. I do want to give you some warnings that there is some anti-Semitism sentiments, like on page 1, throughout the rest of the book. I think they were trying to show what it was like to be in that part of the world and how everyone blamed everything on the Jews at that time. Remember that this took place right after World War I. The most interesting part of this novella is that because it's taking place during a historical time, the back of the book lists a whole bunch of historical facts that they discovered when they were doing research for this novella. While I think this novella is number 10 on my list because it didn't have the strongest plot and the representation of dragons was a little disappointing in my opinion, I did think that the history of this part of the world was really interesting. I thought the way they added in just a little sprinkling of magic was very, very well done. So if that's something that you're into, this novella is for you. Number 9 is Servant Mage by Kate Elliott. This novella has a gorgeous cover, and it follows a light mage named Felion, who struggles through a world that indentures or enslaves mages from childhood because everyone else is afraid of magic. This novella was a fun read and really involved in the world. However, I feel like Kate Elliott maybe bit off too much because I felt a little disappointed when the novella finished. I felt like this should have been a novel instead of a novella, and that's why it's a little bit lower down on my list. Number 8 is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This novella is one that I talked about in my disturbing books for Halloween. This one is a retelling of the Edgar Allan Poe Fall of the House of Usher, which is a short story that T. Kingfisher decided to flesh out. And she added in the idea of zombie fungus to make the story a little bit more creepy and atmospheric. I highly recommend you pick up this novella if that's something that you're a little bit into and if you're a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Number 7. Number 7 is a tie between two novellas. These novellas are a tie because they both involving the classic argument of science versus technology. So the first one is my main man, Adrian Tchaikovsky, with Elder Race. This novella was very popular this year and it is a standalone, which makes it great. I also mentioned it on my top 10 sci-fi novella lists, which I will link for you in the description below. It is a great novella. I love his writing style, but it's not his best. So because of that, it is a little bit lower on the list. And it's tied with The Black Tides of Heaven by Neon Yang. Again, this is another novella series that deals with science versus magic. However, this one takes a little bit different approach. This one is the first of 4 novellas, and they do put all 4 novellas into one specific novel if you're interested in finding that. I think they just call it the Tenserate series. But this one, very first one, follows the twins of a female dictator who oppresses her people and controls all knowledge of both science and magic with an iron fist. This story is very much a coming of age of the twins of this dictator, and they get to decide between science and the people or magic and their mother, and they each must choose a side. The rest of the series deals with all of their choices and consequences of what happens, and it's very much a silk punk fantasy novella, which was kind of a very fun atmosphere that you don't see a whole lot. For people who really liked Grace of Kings, you'll probably really enjoy this setting. And there's a lot of LGBT LGBTQ representation in these novellas. So that brings us to number 6, Inside Job by Connie Willis. I know that this is kind of shiny. Connie Willis is really well known for her amazing novellas. This is the only one I've ever read by her, and it follows Rob, who is a private investigator who gets a case about a psychic who's doing seances, speaking to the dead for the rich. And he's a skeptic by nature, so of course he takes the case because he needs the money, what private investigator doesn't, and tries to disprove the psychic, only realizing that some of the pieces don't quite fit together. This novella wraps up really well. However, what's really interesting about it is it's really hard to get a hold of. If you look inside the cover, this hardcover edition is listed for $53, and if it's signed, it goes for $150 online, which is crazy. I have never seen a novella that's worth more than a novel. I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to find and why it's worth so much is I think it's out of print. So I do recommend you check this out, but if you have a hard time, I recommend checking your library, which is where I found my copy for $2. So maybe consider that if you're interested in checking out some of Connie Willis's stuff. I will also tell you that I personally met Connie Willis at the Hugo Awards this year, and she is so awesome and so nice. Check out this novella. It was well worth the read. And that brings us to Comeuppance Served Cold. This novella came out just this year, I believe, and is occurring in the 1920s, and it's a heist. A very interesting magical heist. What made this novella particularly interesting wasn't just the heist, but the way they put this together. So the first chapter is the crime, and then the rest of the chapters alternate between point of view, trying to show you piece by piece how the crime was committed until the very end, where the mastermind is revealed on how they did it. I thought this one was so well executed. It was a really interesting read, and it kept me on my seat the entire time. I read this in one sitting. So if you're down for a 1920s heist, you should definitely check out this novella. Number 4 on our fantasy list, and that is Penrick's Demon by Louis Bujold McMaster. I'm probably saying all of that wrong. This novella follows Penrick, who is an elderly lady who was in a carriage accident, and as he goes to try to help her, she bequeaths with her last breath her magical powers. The rest of the novella deals with him dealing with the fact that he now has magical powers in the form of this demon that possesses him. And this novella was really fun. It reads like a first chapter in an epic fantasy saga, and it is one of 11 novellas in this whole series. So it's almost like one big fantasy novel just broken down into 11 novellas. It's also told in that epic fantasy description, so if that's something that you're really looking for, this fantasy novella might be right up your alley. And now we get to the top 3. Number 3 is Envy of Angels by Matt Wallace. This novella is one of 4 that has been a completed series that was just a whole bunch of good fun times. We follow Darren and Lena, who are recently graduated chefs who are looking for jobs and heavily recruited by a very suspicious, highly paid restaurant called Sin du Jour. And they accept the job because they need the money, and they discover that this out of the way, really fancy restaurant is serving demons. And they're required to serve a bunch of different magical type creatures to the demons. For those who are a little bit more easily offended on the religious side, this novella series is probably not for you, but it's very irreverent and it's very satirical or parody style with a lot of like tongue-in-cheek humor that I really enjoyed. I was really surprised that not a lot of people are talking about this novella series. If you're looking for something that is a little bit more humorous and just like lighthearted and doesn't take itself too seriously, this is the novella series for you. Number 2, The Empress of Salt and Fortune. This novella series, and I believe 3 of the novellas are already out in print. However, this first one could stand alone very easily, follows the story of Rabbit, who was the Empress's handmaid. And we're we're following her story as she's an old woman, telling us because the Empress has already died, and she's telling the story of what the Empress had to deal with and what she had to go through, and we get to discover why she's important throughout the rest of the novel. This one was really interesting because it's told from a different perspective and a different culture, and it was just a really good read. I was surprised by how much depth the author fit into such a small little book. So highly recommend if you haven't read it already. I want to do just a couple honorable mentions. And the first one I want to bring up is Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. It is a novella series. It didn't make my list because I don't really like Seanan McGuire's characters. For some reason, I'm really having a hard time connecting to them. It obviously won the Hugo, so a lot of people really enjoy this series. It takes place at a boarding school that only allows children who have gone to Portal Fantasy Worlds and are having a really hard time returning to our typical daily life. Each novella follows a different student, and we learn all about what fantasy world they went to. Some are really good and some are not so good, and it's changed the child in some way. This is a fun read and should be something that is up my alley. However, I just can't get into it. So if this is something that you think would be up your alley, maybe you should try out this very first novella. The next honorable mention is Cold Forge Flame by Marie Brennan. Marie Brennan wrote the beloved Lady Trent series, and she also wrote, or co-wrote, I guess, the Rook and Rose series that is gaining a lot of popularity this year. I really like Marie Brennan's writing style. However, this novella, and there's a second one in this series if you're interested, kind of shows that she was still an amateur writer at the time. She was still playing around with her writing style, and you really feel it in these novellas. So it still feels a little bit incomplete, not as fleshed out as it could have been, and because of that, it had to be in the honorable mention section. And that brings us to our number one, which is The Jewel and Her Lapidary by Fran Wilde. This one is the first of 3 in a series. However, the third book is yet to come out. This first novella could stand alone if you wanted to. I thought that what was so spectacular about this book was that you could be the main character. The way that she brings us into the story is a main character who is waking up after being hit on the head, and she doesn't quite remember what's going on. So we get to follow the character and learn what's happening as she learns what's happening. And she's discovering that her kingdom is being overthrown right now. And she has to make a whole bunch of decisions, but she doesn't quite remember what it is she's supposed to do. This makes the read of this novel really good. It pulls at my heartstrings. It made me feel the character's emotions. I thought that this was a spectacular fantasy novella that I think everyone should read. I highly recommend it. And that does it for my top 10 fantasy novellas. If you have any other novellas that you'd like me to check out, we'll have to redo this list next year and see if anything changes. Until next time.